Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 29 of It's Murder Up North. Today's episode was a listener suggestion, so a huge thank you to Hax Ola. Not only for your suggestion, but for listening and supporting the show. If you want to recommend a case, please don't hesitate to contact me via Twitter or Facebook. Today's case does involve discussions of sexual assault, so I completely understand if you wish to skip this one. I particularly struggle with cases involving rape. However, if there is a need to tell the story, I will. And this one is not just a story of the vile acts of one man, but the courage of his survivors and the dedication of the investigators who never stopped searching for him. I also believe it is a story of hope, the hope that just because a case lies dormant for 2 decades doesn't mean it won't be solved. My podcast of the week is the fabulous Death by Champagne. Please support the bubbly hosts. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist the bad pun. Mackenzie and Liv. Here is a sneak peek of their show.
Hey listeners, if you're tuning into this show, 1, you have good taste, and 2, you might enjoy another show that we host called Death by Champagne, the podcast here to keep you up at night. I'm Mackenzie.
And I'm Olivia.
We have topics in all realms. From the reality of true crime to the depths of the occult, we have dozens of episodes to binge that range from hair-raising scares to infuriating miscarriages of justice.
We've covered everything from the origins of Satan to the crimes of an unidentified serial killer in our hometown of St. Louis. Other episodes include tales of unsolved mysteries, murder investigations, disappearances, cold cases, hauntings, folklore, and people in history that are stranger than fiction.
In Season 3, you can join us for a true crime book club, giving in-depth coverage on cases living in the darkest corners of our bookshelves. Our first multi-part series is on the crimes of Gary Ridgway, focusing on his family, victims, and survivors.
So grab your cat keychain, surround yourself in a salt circle, lock your doors, and unlock that phone.
Hail Satan!
And pop some bottles.
Now, let's head to the episode. My first job when I left college was working on a shoe concession in a department store. I loved the job, but unfortunately none of the gorgeous shoes would fit me, as I have tiny size 2 feet. For my international listeners, that is a size 35 or an American size 4. Naturally, we had the usual shoeaholics who were in every week adding to their growing collection, and the most popular styles were always those with a stiletto heel. A recent article in Vogue magazine recorded the history of this iconic piece of footwear. The origins of a heeled shoe can be traced back to the Greeks and subsequently nobility of the 16th century, when the noble women of Venice would wear heels to keep their skirts out of the mud. In the 17th century, soldiers wore them to keep their feet in stirrups as they rode their horses. And by the 18th century, French royalty wore red heels to symbolise their power and authority. At the end of the 18th century, the heel, once considered unisex, was becoming more fashionable amongst women. Over time, the heel increased in height, and according to the Vogue article, the razor-thin stiletto is a 20th century invention, named after an Italian knife, with a slender blade and a needle-sharp point. The heel was engineered in the 1950s when new materials and techniques invented for aircraft carriers were applied to the shoe's construction. Once the heel had become popular amongst the starlets of Hollywood, it became a must-have accessory for women around the world. The Vogue article concludes, quote, "Today, the stiletto remains a staple on the catwalk and a signature for designers like Jimmy Choo, Oscar de la Renta, and Christian Louboutin. While the heels might have refracted ideas about sexuality and femininity throughout history, it's clear that it has now come to represent empowerment, liberation, and ultimately the playful side of fashion. There is no denying that wearing a heel can allow a woman to feel confident and empowered. However, there is another side to this must-have wardrobe staple, which was highlighted by Vogue, quote, "Fetishistic aspects of the stiletto have gained the heel a reputation as a powerful tool of seduction. The structure of the shoe elongates the legs and forces the chest forwards and the bottom backwards, accentuating the curves of the female body. At its highest, the heel limits mobility, forcing those who wear it to take smaller steps." I briefly touched on shoe fetishism in episode 16, in which Tracy Stewart enthralled her clients by creating pornographic images centered around her wearing heels. Shoe fetishism is often labeled as a psychological disorder. Norman Scott, Associate Professor of Psychology at Iowa State University, stated, quote, "Fetishism is a type of psychosexual disorder where individuals have intense fantasies that involve intense sexual urges or sexual fantasies through non-living objects. To be classified as having a fetish, one must have urges for a 6-month period and have an exclusive focus on the means of intense sexual behaviour. The urges or behaviour must cause substantial disturbance to the person's daily life." More prevalent in men, shoe fetishism is one of the most common sorry, I cannot say that word, is one of the most common fetishes. However, those who practice it tend not to speak about it publicly. Norman Scott did identify the sometimes negative nature of this psychological disorder. One aspect he highlighted was the detrimental effect it can have on a person's mental health, causing them to suffer from conditions such as depression. Then those with this fetish are less likely to seek help due to the pleasurable aspects of their acts. Scott did point out that, quote, "Some elements of fetishisms could be useful in terms of sexual arousal and enjoyment if two individuals find the fetish mutually arousing." Scott continues, quote, "It's likely there is an element of fetishism in everyone. Potentially, any member of our society, male or female, probably has some fantasies to objects. Certain kinds of clothing seem appealing, like in Victoria's Secret's adverts. There can be a darker side to this condition, which Norman Scott explained, quote, "Persons with extreme focus on fetishism will often perpetrate criminal acts to get a hold of the desired objects. For example, they will often resort to burglary or robbery to procure shoes or boots, and in some instances will pursue the boots on the woman." One of the most infamous and extreme cases of shoe fetishists was the American serial killer Jerome Brudos, who became known as the Lust Killer and the Shoe Fetish Slayer. He was born on January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, and first developed a fascination with high-heeled shoes at just 5 years old, when he discovered a pair of high heels in a junkyard. He would later describe how his mother, having discovered her son wearing the shoes, chastised him and destroyed the heels. This did little to quell his growing fascination with women's footwear, and perhaps due to his mother's actions, he would conceal his growing collection and desires. His sexual fantasies revolved around the arousal he got from women's footwear, yet more concerning was his attraction to violence against women. Soon he found his fantasies were no longer satisfying him, and he began to act upon his urges. As a teenager, he began to follow young women, ambush them, render them unconscious through strangulation, and then he would steal their shoes. By the age of 17, Brudos was sent to a psychiatric hospital, following an attack in which he threatened a woman at knife point and ordered her to comply to his sexual demands. During his 9 months' incarceration at the hospital, Brudos was diagnosed with schizophrenia. By 1968, Brudos escalated from burglary and rape to murder, claiming the lives of 4 women in Oregon. His first victim was 19-year-old Linda Slauson. She was working as a door-to-door salesperson when on January 1968, she unfortunately arrived at the home that Brudos shared with his wife and children, who were in the house at the time. Brudos was able to convince Linda into the basement, where he rendered her unconscious and proceeded to strangle her. Once he had killed her, he went on to pose her body in provocative positions, whilst dressed in clothing and shoes he had stolen from other women. Before disposing of Linda's body in the Willamette River, he removed her left foot, which he kept in a freezer, in order to use it to display the numerous shoes in his collection. 4 months later, in May 1968, 18-year-old Karen Sprinker had been shopping when Brudos abducted her in a car park outside a department store. He once again took her to his home, where he made her pose in provocative positions while he photographed her. He sexually assaulted her, then hung her by the neck from a pulley system he had created in his garage. Once Karen was dead, he had intercourse with her body. Before removing her breasts, he then disposed of her remains in the Willamette River, this time weighing her down by tying her body to a car engine. On November the 26th, 1968, Brudos spotted a young woman at the side of Interstate 5, near Salem. She stood next to her car that had broken down. He stopped to offer 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney some assistance, advising her that she was welcome to call a tow truck from his home. The stranded woman accepted his kind offer. Not long after Jan had gotten into his vehicle, Brudos had strangled her and, just like with his previous victims, he had intercourse with her body. He kept her lifeless body tied up in his garage, where he followed his now established pattern of dressing his victim, photographing her, and having sexual intercourse with her. He then took her body to the Willamette River, weighed her down, and left her there. He struck again on April the 21st, 1969, when he came across 24-year-old Sharon Wood, whom he tried to abduct at gunpoint. However, his attempt failed. Undeterred, the following day he targeted 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith, but once again she was able to get away. Tragically, 22-year-old Linda Saley was not so fortunate. Brudos abducted her on the 23rd of April from a shopping centre car park. She was subjected to the same horrific treatment as his previous victims, and her body would join them in the Willamette River. Following a tip from a university student, Brudos was brought in for questioning. His home was searched, uncovering the incriminating evidence of his crimes. Upon his arrest, Jerome Brudos admitted his guilt. In June 1969, Brudos was given 3 life sentences. 14 years later, and almost 5,000 miles away, fear began to grip the streets of South Yorkshire, as a perpetrator was attacking women who were wearing stiletto heels, and his attacks were becoming increasingly violent. The first reported attack occurred on the outskirts of the town of Rotherham, which lies to the north-east of the city of Sheffield, the birthplace of former England goalkeeper David Seaman, Top Gear and Grand Tour presenter James May, and of course the idols of my childhood, Paul and Barry Chuckle, aka the Chuckle Brothers. In recent times, the town has gained notoriety for being at the centre of a child sex abuse scandal, after Jane Senior, a youth worker, publicly exposed the local authority, police and social services for failing to respond to allegations that at least 1,400 children had been sexually abused and exploited, with some cases occurring over many years. This has resulted in numerous convictions and is still the focus of an ongoing investigation. In February 1983, the newspaper headlines were reporting the arrest of serial killer Dennis Nilsson, who had been caught after dismembered human remains were found at his flat in London. However, in Rotherham, far away from the sensational news story, people were carrying on with their lives. Saturday night was when workers headed to the town to drink and socialise. As the evenings wore on, people started heading home into the cold night. A 53-year-old woman who lived on the outskirts of the town was amongst them. As she headed out of the town, she bid farewell to her friends, who headed off in different directions. The buildings she passed became scarce as she approached the rural boundary of the town. Alone and isolated, the woman's heels echoed in the still night as she continued along the footpath that ran parallel with the road. She headed towards home. Fields lay on either side of her now. She passed a dirt track which led into a thicket, when suddenly she was grabbed from behind, a hand placed over her mouth. Her attacker dragged her backwards along the dirt track, deeper into the thicket. She thrashed and kicked in a desperate bid to break free. The trees disappeared, and the abductor threw the woman down in the long grass of a field out of view of the road. The man bound the woman's arms and legs, placed a gag over her mouth, and proceeded to undress her. Attempted to rape the frightened woman, but he failed, and possibly embarrassed, he removed the woman's dark blue pointed heels, picked up her bag, and fled, leaving his victim alone in the darkness. Courageously, the woman reported the incident, and the police conducted a thorough search of the crime scene, yet they were unable to find anything of significance, and within weeks of the attack, the inquiry hit a dead end. Between February and December, there were no reported attacks. This doesn't necessarily mean that no assaults occurred. As stated in previous episodes, rapes go unreported for a variety of reasons, but sadly, in the 1980s, it was something you didn't talk about. Women were made to feel like it was their fault. Police did not take reports seriously, and even members of the woman's family would judge her. Even now, over 30 years later, there is still a stigma that should never have existed in the first place. It was in December 1983 that the attacker struck again. Once again, it was a cold winter's night. A 21-year-old was making her way home from a trip to the local pub. She was traversing the short distance back to her house, walking along well-lit residential streets, when out of the shadows a man grabbed her from behind. The woman's terrified screams broke the silence as the assailant placed a pair of stockings around the woman's neck and pulled her violently backwards down a narrow alleyway. His hand pressed firmly over her mouth to stifle any further cries for help. Beyond the alleyway was a small footpath and an open patch of waste ground onto which the man continued to drag his victim, until he was satisfied they were away from prying eyes or ears. He lay the trembling 21-year-old on the grass and bound her arms and legs, before pulling her clothing up over her face. He then proceeded to assault her. When he had finished, he gently removed the woman's black shoes and hurried away. The woman reported the assault to the police, who searched the area where the attack occurred and found no significant clues. They also spoke to local residents, a number of whom stated they had heard a woman screaming, but they had dismissed it as someone messing around and didn't investigate. With no eyewitnesses and the victim being unable to provide a description of her attacker, the police couldn't proceed any further. The 21-year-old had to endure the additional trauma of evidence retrieval from her body. Swabs and samples were taken to be stored, as at the time police were unable to do any more with them. Unable to move the investigation forwards and the two incidents still unconnected, the case quickly went cold. As before, the attacker went dormant for 10 months. Whether he had still been active and his crimes had gone unreported, or something else prevented him from committing his assaults, it does seem an odd coincidence that 10 months passed before he struck again. Consistent with his previous attacks, he chose his next victim in the early hours of a winter's day. It was the 13th of October, 1984, when he approached a young woman returning home from a night out. Once again, the woman was wearing a pair of high heels that made the characteristic clickety-clack on the pavement beneath her feet, the sound that drew the rapist out of the shadows. This time he spoke to his victim. He told her he was down on his luck, having recently lost his job as a coal miner. He then told the woman he just wanted money. Shaking, she began to search for her purse in her bag. Now his target was distracted, he pounced. Grabbing the woman, her bag fell to the floor as he pulled her off the footpath. He followed the same habit as before, binding the woman's hands behind her back, tying her legs together and gagging the frightened woman. He attempted to have intercourse with his victim. For some reason, he failed, but he didn't give up. He chose instead to masturbate over her legs. When he had finished, he stuck to his signature, stealing the woman's stiletto heels. The failed attempt must have spurred him on to find another victim, as just 2 weeks later he struck again. This time his victim was a 25-year-old who he dragged into a cubicle of a public toilet in the town of Herringthorpe and sexually assaulted her. The victim said after the attack, quote, "I was thinking what's going to happen. I want to get out of this alive. All I said was don't hurt me." During the attack, the assailant did something odd. As he raped the victim in the dimly lit cubicle, her shoe slipped from her foot and landed on the tiled floor with a loud clatter. This caused the man to pause. He bent down and picked up the slender-heeled shoe, placed it back onto his victim's foot, and then he continued his assault. When he had finished, he removed her shoes and jewellery and left. The woman later recalled, quote, "I was never the same person afterwards. I just wanted to forget it, or try to anyway. I had to blank it out, otherwise I wouldn't have coped. I don't know who he was, and I've always been looking over my shoulder." With this fourth attack, the police were finally able to link the cases, due to the similarities in the perpetrator's modus operandi. All 4 victims had been out late at night, they had been tied up in a specific fashion, and had all been gagged with stockings. The main indicator that these attacks were connected was the rapist's habit of stealing the victim's shoes, all of whom had been wearing stilettos. Those victims who got a glimpse of their attacker told police he was a white male. However, his face was concealed by a stocking mask. He was in his late teens to early 20s. They estimated he was between 5'7" to 5'9", and he had a local accent. He had thick black hair, dark eyes, and a slender nose. Knowing these cases were linked, and that they had a serial rapist loose on the streets, the police started by questioning non-sex offenders, all of whom proved to be very cooperative, allowing the police to search their properties and answered questions freely. It quickly became evident that none of them were involved. Needing to catch the man before he struck again, the police tried an unorthodox and risky approach. They decided to carry out an undercover operation, in which a female police officer would be dressed as though she had been on a night out. She would walk the streets in a pair of heels, while other officers observed from a distance. For several nights, the officer walked the streets. I know it is part of her job, but the thought of walking along in the dark, waiting for someone to attack her, is terrifying. Sue Hickman described the operation on the documentary Nowhere to Hide, Hunt for the Shoe Rapist as, quote, "It was very scary, because the sole purpose of doing it was actually to try and get attacked. And we wouldn't be able to do it in this day and age, health and safety. You'd be stopped from doing it, but back in the 80s, that's the sort of thing we actually did to try and catch offenders." The operation failed in luring out the perpetrator, and all the police could do was to advise women to take care when out. The usual tips we are so used to hearing now: stay together, know how you're going to get home, and stay safe. Chief Superintendent Bob Herold of South Yorkshire Police advised women in the area to be safe and be aware, stating, quote, "If you have to go out at night, take somebody with you." With just 3 days to Christmas 1984, an 18-year-old girl was making her way home from the local pub in the small town of Hoyland, which lies roughly 7 miles northwest of Rotherham. Having enjoyed the festive atmosphere of the pub, she set off on the short walk home. It was a chilly winter's night, but she was warmed by the twinkling lights that hung from trees, windows, and doorways. Her route was lined by houses, their curtains drawn tight, smoke gently billowing from the chimneys, characteristic smell of coal fires filling the air. It was quiet and calm as she headed down Millhouses Street. on one side of which stood detached bungalows set back slightly from the road behind low brick walls and iron gates. Opposite these was a recreation ground, which in the day was popular with children playing on the park and people walking their dogs. But at night it was dark and silent. She walked on the side closest to the houses and quickened her pace, when suddenly she was grabbed from behind. Before she knew what was happening, her assailant had dragged her into the darkness of the recreation ground, unable to scream due to the gag over her mouth. He tied up her arms and legs and forced himself upon her. Despite the attack occurring so close to houses, no one saw or heard anything that night, and the attack was so sudden and terrifying that the victim was unable to recall details of the man who assaulted her. Once again, the police were no closer to catching the perpetrator. They exhausted all avenues of investigation with no new leads, no potential suspects, and having done everything they could with the evidence they had collected, the case stalled. It became a waiting game, but not only did they not know who the rapist was, they could not foresee when or where he would offend next. 1984 became 1985. The female population in the areas remained vigilant, heeding the police warning, not venturing out alone, staying in groups. As the year progressed and October arrived, the police were on high alert. There had been no attacks, yet if the suspect reverted to his attacks being 10 months apart, they felt he may strike again soon. But he didn't. For the whole of 1985, there were no reported assaults that matched his MO. The attacker seemed to have disappeared. Police looked into the various reasons for this. They had checked death records to see if he had passed away, hospital admissions, had he been injured to the extent he was unable to continue his attacks. They also looked into arrests and conviction records to see if their suspect had been incarcerated for another crime. For all their diligent searches, they drew a blank. In Rotherham and the surrounding areas, people started to relax, as the fears of the last few years ebbed away. It had been a wet and windy day on Saturday, the 2nd of August 1986, when the 18-year-old left the Towpath pub in Swinton. Having had a couple of drinks with her friends, she was heading to her boyfriend's house. She walked through a residential area, houses on both sides, and the road barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. The sound of her heels reverberating around her, then the sound of rushing feet and a piercing scream. It was her scream, as a strong arm coiled around her neck, and a cold blade was pressed against her cheek, the knife drowning her desire to scream. The man almost lifted her off the ground, dragged the 18-year-old backwards through the street, passing houses where people sat watching television or getting ready for bed. As they passed the last 2 houses, the terrified teenager watched as the lights on the street faded from view. He pulled her onto a patch of barren wasteland, where he could be alone with his prey. At one point she managed to break free of his grasp, but she didn't get very far, as she stumbled in her heels on the rough terrain. He caught up with her and struck her with his fist. The girl bravely fought against him, with every ounce of her strength, and for which he beat her violently, inflicting serious injuries to her face and body. He tied her hands and legs with tights. Now restrained, weakened, and unable to fight back, he taunted the girl. She remembers, quote, "He told me, I'm going to have sexual intercourse with you." He used those exact words, and then he raped me. It wasn't until the following morning that her motionless figure was found by a man out walking his dog. She was semi-conscious and had clearly endured a brutal assault. Her body beaten, her clothes torn, and her high-heeled shoes missing. The police knew that this was the same attacker, and he was escalating in his violence. This time he had left clues at the scene. Not only had he left behind the rope he had bound the 18-year-old with, but it appeared the perpetrator may have lost a distinctive signet ring. So one of my favourite tools to use when doing my research is Google Street View. It gives me a clearer understanding of where the crimes occurred. For example, with the Claudia Lawrence case, I literally traced the most likely route she would have taken to work, and for the Derek Bird episode, it allowed me to get a true understanding of the large geographical area he covered. For this episode, I wanted to understand the areas in which these women were attacked, and the last location was particularly shocking. Because of the houses that surrounded the area, he could have so easily been seen and possibly captured. But unfortunately, he managed to commit his assault and disappear. Not only on that night, but as far as what has been reported, he never committed another offence. The case files were stored, and as the years passed, the terror that stalked the streets became a forgotten nightmare, except for his victims, who lived in a constant state of fear. One woman was unable to leave her house. Others reported that they were always looking over their shoulders and were unable to trust anyone. That terrifying thought that they could pass him on the street, be stood next to him in the supermarket, or be sharing the same bus as the man who ruined their lives. Despite periodic reviews of the case files, it was only with the introduction of the National DNA Database that South Yorkshire Police would make the breakthrough that could help identify the serial rapist. Fortunately for the cold case team, the evidence collected from the 1980s was still available to them, which sadly is not always the case. These included slides that contained the traces of semen that had been found at the scene. These were once collected to prove that a rape had occurred. However, 16 years later, these little squares of plastic held the key to identifying the attacker. When the DNA recovered from slides was processed through the database, the investigators were disappointed to learn no match had been found. They created a criminal profile of the offender, who, according to the expert profiler, may have had a criminal record for similar offences. However, he would likely be married or in a committed relationship with children. This profile led police to seek the DNA profiles of any ex-convicts. Police reached out to the press to help generate new leads, but nothing came from their efforts. The case once again wound down until another revolution in forensics became available to them. The police were now able to look for familial DNA matches. If a member of the perpetrator's family had committed a crime, this should hopefully be in the database. The main problem with familial DNA, it can generate thousands of potential names, which then have to be narrowed down through various criteria including ethnicity, age and location. This is a painstaking task in which officers have to manually search through each name and eliminate them as they go along. After 2 years of combing through the list of names, only 5 remained. One of these 5 was a woman who had been arrested for drink driving in the year 2000, for which her DNA had been added to the database. When the police learned that she had a brother, they were naturally eager to speak to him. However, the lady insisted she was no longer in contact with her brother. Unable to proceed with this line of inquiry, the police left her home. Unbeknownst to them, the woman then made a phone call to her brother, a man called James Lloyd, advising him of the police investigation. A couple of hours later, she rang South Yorkshire Police, claiming she feared her brother was going to harm himself. But she was unable to tell them where he lived. However, the police were able to identify his address. By running a search through their records, they discovered that James Lloyd had been a victim of a crime after he had reported the theft of some garden ornaments from his property. The emergency services arrived at the home of James Lloyd and were ushered through to the garage by his son. In the garage they found a note, tablets and a stepladder, above which hung a rope. James's son had returned home from school and found his dad. When the police and paramedics entered the room, James was extremely intoxicated and in an extremely distressed state. While Lloyd was being treated at Barnsley Hospital, investigators became aware that on the day of his suicide attempt he had left work in a hurry following a phone call with his sister. He then proceeded to call various friends and relatives, admitting that he was responsible for something truly awful in his past, and it had finally caught up with him. While still in the hospital, James Lloyd was arrested on suspicion of rape in March 2006. As he was transported to the police station for questioning, he stated, quote, "I was a bastard 20 years ago." For one officer, the apprehension of the shoe rapist was the end of 20 years of her dogged determination to bring him to justice. Sue Hickman had been the rookie police officer who had been bait for the rapist during the undercover operation in which she donned a miniskirt and high heels and walked the dark streets. She had never given up on the investigation. It is possible that the risky operation allowed her to walk in the victim's shoes, knowing her fear was nothing in comparison to what they went through. In 2006, she had risen to the rank of detective inspector and spearheaded the cold case investigation. As James Lloyd was being held in custody, the police conducted a search of the home he shared with his wife and 2 children. It was a typical 4-bedroom detached family home on a respectable street that had been built about 5 years prior. Inside the house were signs of a normal family life. Nothing overtly indicated the dark secrets the 50-year-old father and husband had kept inside. Looking through the immaculate and well-loved family home, the police uncovered evidence concealed in the master bedroom. They found pornography, including materials that pointed to an interest in shoe fetishism. There were explicit tapes of James and his wife, which would be used as evidence in court, and a document entitled, quote, "The Perfect Victim," with descriptions that mirrored the rapes committed by the shoe rapist. One of the officers conducting the search stated, quote, "We wanted to search his property and his house. In his garage he had some high-heel shoes, but they looked as if they had been bought from a website for fetishes. They were not the shoes that a woman could possibly wear. He certainly had a horrendous fetish for high heels. I spent many hours watching videos of what he did with them. It was clear to me that the offences stopped because he had gotten married and he was living out his fantasies with his wife." Yet there was nothing that linked Lloyd directly to the crimes. That was all about to change when a search of his workplace was conducted. James had started as an apprentice at a printing company in the 1970s, and by the time of his arrest, he was the manager. As such, he had an office situated on an upper floor, which his employees advised police that James spent a lot of time up there, even at the weekends, and he was very strict about who had access. At first glance, just like his home, it was a normal office space with the usual fixtures and fittings, but beneath their feet, officers found a trapdoor, which concealed a treasure trove of evidence. The officer leading the search described the scene, quote, "We found hundreds of pairs of shoes. I just remember them bringing these shoes down. It was marvellous. I knew then we had our man. It was just so many really, really high heels. And they had obviously been worn, and they did belong to someone at one point. It was quite clear to me there were more victims than had come forward." The evidence was enough to bring James Lloyd to trial. But who was the man who had brought fear to the streets of South Yorkshire? James Lloyd was born in 1956, although I was unable to find much about his childhood, except that he was born and raised in the area around Barnsley. He started working at the printing firm in his late teens, and married his childhood sweetheart, with whom he had a child. But the marriage didn't last, and by 1983, James met Patricia and the couple married on the 2nd of August 1985. Just a reminder, his last attack was on the 3rd of August 1986, the day after his first wedding anniversary. During the 1980s, James worked nights as a taxi driver, and police speculate this is how he was able to commit his crimes without drawing suspicion, especially in residential areas. No one's going to suspect a taxi at 11 o'clock at night. The attacks that had been reported all happened within 5 miles of his workplace, the final attack being just over a mile away. It is not known why he stopped in 1986. Speculation is that his wife Patricia was fulfilling his sexual desires, and others argue that having a daughter made him stop. Only James Lloyd truly knows the reason, and the question is, did he stop? So many rapes go unreported, and the hundreds of shoes found in his possession, hidden away, have led investigators to suggest he may have had more unidentified victims. James Lloyd appeared at Sheffield Crown Court in 2006. The defendant stood in the dock, still portraying the facade of a respectable family man, dressed in a tailored black suit and tie, paired with a crisp white shirt. During the proceedings, the court was presented with the decades-old evidence. They heard testimony from the survivors of his attacks, women whose lives had been destroyed by the man who had continued to live his life, seemingly unaffected by his actions. The prosecutor, Jeremy Baker QC, described how James Lloyd restrained his victims by tying their knees to their necks, leaving them unable to move or defend themselves. One aspect of Lloyd's life was brought to light in court, as the tapes of his sexual activities with his wife were shown. They showed that he would tie his wife up in a similar fashion to his victims. She would always be wearing stilettos, which if they fell from her feet, he would pause to place them back on her feet, just as he did with one of his victims. In some of the videos, Lloyd used stilettos as part of penetrative sex. It also appeared as though his wife was in an unconscious state in some of the recordings, leading to speculation that she may have been drugged. Mrs. Lloyd, however, defended her husband, vehemently denying that he had ever drugged her, and claiming at no point did he ever force her to do anything she did not consent to. She stated, quote, "He has always been a good husband, good father, and hard-working. I had never had any indication he had the capacity for anything like this. I can't relate the husband I know to the man who has committed these crimes. I have never had any inkling he had any capacity for anything like this. It is not the person I know and have lived with all these years." During sentencing, Judge Goldsack mentioned the tapes, quote, "It may be your sexual fantasies have simply been contained within the relationship. Were it to end, you may well be tempted to carry them out with other women, giving them no choice whether to consent or not." Because Lloyd had previously admitted his guilt, he did not have a trial by jury, in which he would potentially have faced a fixed term of 35 years. Due to his admission, he was handed a minimum term of 15 years, before the possibility of parole. During sentencing, the court was read statements from both of James Lloyd's children, causing the 50-year-old to cry in the dock. In summing up, Judge Alan Goldsack QC stated, quote, "Few sexual cases are more serious than these. For the last 20-plus years, you've been living a lie, with your family, your friends, your work colleagues, and generally. These were the sort of rapes that are every woman's nightmare. They are terrifying offences, set upon by a stranger while walking home, with no help available, and not knowing whether the assault will end with sexual degradation, or go further. Seeing their rapist being brought to justice brought some solace to those who survived his attacks, but the scars he inflicted ran deep, and many of them will never fully recover from his vile acts. All victims of sexual assault are rightly given anonymity. However, one of the survivors waived her rights in order to speak about her ordeal, hopefully to help others who have been in similar situations. Justine Kelly was only 18 years old when she was attacked by Lloyd. She now works as a care assistant and has a daughter with her ex-husband, a man who she met a year after her assault. She blames the trauma Lloyd inflicted on her as the cause of the breakdown of her 7-year marriage. Speaking after the sentencing, Justine stated, quote, "Seeing Lloyd arrested and facing a life sentence has helped me to finally feel at rest. I am satisfied he has got his just desserts at long last." In a statement read out on behalf of Lloyd's victims, quote, "James Desmond Lloyd has been at liberty for over 20 years. Knowing what he had done to a number of women, he has hidden behind the facade of respectability and has shown no remorse for the crimes he has committed. We now hope that this enables people to move on with their lives." Unfortunately, some of the people who were affected by Lloyd are no longer with us today to see justice served, and they too are in our thoughts today. We are aware that had it not been for modern technology surrounding DNA, Lloyd would still be a free man. I just want to take a moment to pay tribute to the courage of the survivors, the women who were brave enough to report their ordeal. It is never your fault. You didn't ask for it, and you should not feel afraid to report it. If you or anyone you know have been subjected to sexual assault, please do not suffer in silence. Speak up and talk about it. There are so many support groups who can help, and I will list some of them in the show notes. Thank you for joining me for episode 29 of It's Murder Up North. We hit the big 3-0 next week. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.